Welcome back to the podcast history of our world. Chapter 51, Nirvana. In the last episode, we left off with Prince Arjuna of the Bhagavad Gita in a deep existential quagmire over just what the heck reality really is. The only way to know for sure is when Krishna gives him a taste of the red pill, sending him through the wardrobe to what's really behind the curtain, and, the rabbit hole. Yeah. But while Krishna's cosmic moment might describe reality, it doesn't actually explain what reality is. In a historical context, putting a timestamp on this isn't gonna happen, but at some point a Brahmin priest or a bunch of Brahmins thought about it and came to the conclusion that everything in this universe, and the universe itself, is Brahman. Sort of a soul, but not really, and sort of a real substance, but also not really. Actually, it's described as being unable to be defined, so there's that. And no, I don't think it's a coincidence that the name of this universal stuff sounds almost exactly like the priest class which came up with it. Well, even though Brahman is everything, there's also Atman, the individual soul, which of course is still technically Brahman because everything is, but it's contained inside you, and therefore yours as well. Keeping in mind, none of this can truly be defined, but probably the best analogy for it is a water metaphor. If Brahman can be compared to an ocean, then the soul, or Atman, is part of that ocean contained in a vessel, your body. Which means you too are part of the divine, but disconnected from it. And that's because the Atman is stuck on a cycle of life and death called samsara. You're born, you live, you die. And as soon as you breathe your last breath, your Atman instantly travels into a brand new body. No memories of that previous life, but now stuck in a different vessel. On and on forever and ever. You might not remember what you've done in those previous lives, but the universe will remember for you, and upgrade or downgrade you accordingly. And who you are in this current life is a reflection of your previous lives, based on how much good or bad credit, or karma, you accumulated on the path of dharma, the universal law of things. If you lived a good life, respected the gods, obeyed your family, etc., you'd be rewarded with a better life next time around. If you didn't, you could expect to suffer, as you sort of work off that negative karma. Keep on being good and obediently following the dharmic way, and one day your Atman might break free of samsara and merge with the universe. Keep on being bad and you'll continue to be punished with worse and worse fates. Maybe coming back as a dung beetle or something. I don't know. Except if you think about it, what this is saying is that if you're currently suffering in this life, it's because you deserve it. Imagine you're walking down a busy city street. You see a legless beggar. Oh, and it looks like he's got some nasty skin disease too. Ugh, he must have done something really bad in the previous life. And you as a member of the Brahmin class, well, you must have been really good in a previous life. In conclusion, out of the way, street rat. Be glad you're not a dung beetle. I can hear you already wondering what the heck kind of system this is, or no, that's not how karma works and I'm wrong. And yeah, it's gotten gentler over the years, but especially during the Vedic period of India, this is it. Try to forget your silly 21st century notions of social mobility and charity towards the less fortunate. Instead, think about a society that is reinforced not just from law and order, but from the very cosmos itself. You're a warrior prince? Get out there and slay your enemies. Born into a family of shoemakers? Then be the best shoemaker you can. Rice farmer? Well, you grow that rice like a boss. Clean outhouses? Well, somebody's got to do it, right? But what about those who life has dealt a really bad hand to? Well, they need to accept their fate with quiet dignity and hope for a better hand next time. But is it right to help them? Are we not all brothers and sisters? If we have the means, do we not have an obligation to ease their suffering? Yeah, but the Vedic texts of the Upanishads and Puranas explain why they deserve this fate. And what's the point of helping those people now if in the next life they'll be fine? What's the point of anything then? Oof, talk about a karmic headache. So while other civilizations around the world were fighting and exploring and all that stuff, and the various kingdoms of northern India were also fighting and flourishing, there was another sort of battle going on. The karmic system, while accepted by most, was questioned by some. While Hindu sadhus or sages explored the secrets of Brahman, and some ascetic monks called Shramanas explored the universe through starvation or twisting and posing the body in what we know as yoga, Two different leaders would come to prominence in the late 500s BC, not as warriors or statesmen, but as philosophers and teachers, radically changing the social and religious landscape of India. We start in what is now the foothills of Nepal, in the mid-6th century BC. This area is ruled by the Shakya clan, a confederation of warrior kings. One of these guys is Suddhodana, and if you recall from last time, they're not so much kings as chieftains, with committees and wise men and that sort. Suddhodana's capital is the city of Kapilavastu, but we're more interested in a little town not too far away from that called Lumbini. Around 563 BC, his wife Mahamaya gives birth to a boy whom they name Siddhartha, which means one whose purpose has been achieved. Sadly, she passes away 7 days after the young prince's birth. Young Siddhartha is relocated fairly soon back to the capital, where dad raises him in all the ways a prince should be raised, in war, in education, and the gods, and what his responsibilities and obligations are. Also, all the luxuries and opulence that come with that title. Eventually, he even married the lovely and beautiful princess Yasodhara, who was also his cousin and bore him a son. What a life. Except Siddhartha was not allowed to leave the palace grounds, ever. And for 29 years, this was his life. But his curiosity about the outside world finally got the best of him. 29 years later, and one day he ordered his chariot driver to leave the palace and tour the capital. Traditionally, the story goes that Siddhartha first came across a diseased person, then an old man, and finally a decaying corpse. The prince was shell-shocked by this revelation, that there are forces in this world beyond anyone's control that cause immeasurable pain and suffering. And that word, suffering, that really stuck in his craw. Is there a way to not suffer? Or how does one prevent suffering? Well, Siddhartha didn't have the answers, but he did see his opportunity to get those answers in the form of a wandering holy man, one of those ascetics I mentioned. At this, Siddhartha knew he had found his calling, to leave behind a life of luxury and become a seeker of truth. The stories say that he took his best friend with him and snuck out of the palace in the middle of the night to find his destiny. Oh, and that includes abandoning his wife and kid, but hey, higher calling. Siddhartha tries out various methods to conquer suffering, but they all have something in common. They're all really unpleasant. He starts as a poor monk, a mendicant, begging for food, his cloak and bowl his only possessions. Then he tried an even more extreme lifestyle, practicing self-mortification by sleeping on thorns and pushing his body to dangerous levels of starvation, until he fainted and almost drowned in a river. At this point, Siddhartha was so committed to the ascetic life that he had attracted 5 students. But after this close call with death, he had his first profound moment. In his quest to overcome suffering, he's suffering an awful lot. Maybe there's a way to compromise and find a middle way. Perhaps moderation is the answer. Well, his students didn't think so, and they abandoned him, thinking he had gone too soft. Siddhartha needed time to reflect on all this, so he had a nice meal, took a hot bath, and sat down under the shade of a Bodhi tree. There he refused to leave until he had found the answers he was looking for, and he began to meditate. The legends say for 49 days, but on that last day, it hit him. Siddhartha knew the truth. His first destination after reaching this enlightenment was the town of Sarnath, where he found his first audience. Here he gave his first sermon, setting in motion the wheel of Dharma. He reveals his discovery that there are 4 truths in this world. Number 1, life is suffering. Accept it, move on. Number 2, we suffer because we constantly crave and desire things, and even when those desires are met, we still desire more. Number 3, there is a way out, to achieve a state free from suffering and want called Nirvana. And number 4, all you gotta do is follow these 8 simple guidelines to get there. What are they? Well, there's right view, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. That should be all of them. Oh, and live a life of moderation. No nail beds, but no high thread count sheets either. Don't starve yourself, but don't eat that cheeseburger where the bun is 2 grilled cheese sandwiches. That's a thing, you know. His disciples quickly multiplied after listening to him speak, and all agreed Siddhartha, no, that name won't do anymore. He shall be called Buddha, the Enlightened One. Yeah, all agreed he had done it, the first person to ever achieve nirvana and free himself from desire and want. Let's hold on a moment before we continue with Buddha's life to look at a contemporary of his, who also explored the concepts of suffering and enlightenment, but through a different path. Vardhamana was born in 540 BC, somewhere in northern India, to another warrior king clan. As a prince, he shared a very similar upbringing to Siddhartha, living it up in total luxury, marrying a princess and fathering a daughter. Unlike Siddhartha, he knew of the outside world, but didn't just drop everything at once to run off and fix it. He waited until he was 30 and his parents had died. At that point, he sold off his possessions, gave up his kingdom, and left town to become a wandering, homeless monk. And just like Siddhartha, that means leaving the wife and kid at home to become a deadbeat dad. Higher calling. Vardhamana joined up with the Niganthas, a sect whose name means free from bonds. How free? Well, members were given a single loose robe as their only possession in this world. How's that for feeling free? And he became such a staunch advocate that he ripped out his hair and beard to show his dedication. For 12 long years, Vardhamana traveled, begging for food, sleeping outdoors for most of the year, rainy season excluded, suffering taunts and jeers, and even permitting insects and vermin to gnaw at his body. To show he had rejected this world, not because he liked it, And then in the 13th year, something happened. I can't find a straight story here, but it concerns his robe. Either it was lost, it fell apart, or he just took it off one day. But whatever its fate, it was gone. Vardhamana was as free as he's ever gonna get, and the truth dawned on him. He had it. Enlightenment. But what does your birthday suit have to do with enlightenment? Well, as it was later written, a naked monk who perseveres in this conduct sustains repeatedly these and other various painful feelings. The grass pricks him, heat and cold attack him, flies and mosquitoes sting him. A naked monk should be aspiring to freedom from bonds. Penance suits him. Self-denial was the core to his message, and taking the new name Mahavira, which means great hero or victor, he took his message to the public. Mahavira's followers became known as Jains, which refers to the battle against the pleasure and temptations of this world. Actually, the Niganthas were also Jains, but the term gains popularity after Mahavira. In addition, Mahavira also preached an ultra form of non-violence called ahimsa. No animal's life could ever be taken, from the largest elephant to the tiniest gnat. Which means a super strict vegetarian diet that even forbids certain foods like root vegetables and mushrooms. Mahavira believed these foods contained microscopic living beings on them, and, well, he's not wrong. Just think of it as a little extra protein in your diet. Anyway, Mahavira's path to enlightenment meant giving up everything and living as minimally as you could. Buddha's path to enlightenment meant understanding that our desires cause suffering, and it's best to live modestly. Both men took their message on the road, and while they differed in their opinion of how to free oneself from samsara, that cycle of life and death, both agreed on one thing: the old ways were wrong. Harken back to what Krishna said in the Bhagavad Gita, that the present world is an illusion, and reality is so much more. And to dispel that illusion requires careful observance of the system that the gods put in place. Well, that's great and all, but the desire to follow this system for spiritual reward is wrong. How can we be so fine with something that we, still going with Krishna here, acknowledge isn't real? It's like that scene in The Matrix where Cypher, yes, I know I'm making 2 Matrix references in one episode. It's like when Cypher is having dinner with Agent Smith and he says, I know this steak doesn't exist, that when I put it in my mouth, the Matrix is telling my brain that it's juicy and delicious. And you know what I realize? Ignorance is bliss. No, says Mahavira and Buddha, knowing this world is false and embracing that notion anyway is wrong. And weird, but this will only lead to more suffering and pain. Buddha says forget all that stuff about karma and Brahman and stick to the middle way. Mahavira? Heck, he pushes for almost total denial of the gods. What would happen if a god needed an animal sacrifice? Exactly. The two continue to preach until their very last days. Mahavira died in 468 at the age of 72, after reducing his food intake until he starved to death, denying the pleasures of eating until the end. Whereas Buddha was 80 when he died in 487 and supposedly became extremely ill after eating a dish called soft pork, whatever that is. With the death of these two leaders, their followers took it upon themselves to continue spreading the faith, sometimes adding or changing parts to the original doctrine. The Jains had a schism between those who wanted to stick to their naked roots and those who felt it was better in the long run to wear robes and allow women to join. The Buddhists allowed all members of the caste system to join up, which is good, but also added the concept of a bodhisattva to the first texts. This is someone who delays nirvana to help others reach it. The bodhisattva Avalokitesvara is probably the most famous and beloved because she, sometimes the genders are switched, is perpetually on the cusp of becoming a Buddha, but refuses to until everyone else has. But this was added later. Buddha and Mahavira certainly made the biggest impact, but they were hardly the only ones vying for the hearts and souls of South Asia. There's Ajita Kesakambali, an Indian materialist who believed all this spirit talk was complete and total bunk. What's real is right in front of you. Then there's Sanjaya Balathaputta, who preached a sort of agnosticism, admitting it's impossible to say with certainty if anything beyond this world exists. And then there were the Ajavikas, founded by a friend of Mahavira named Goshala Maskariputra, who believed that everyone's life has been planned out to the most extreme detail. So why bother achieving any particular purpose and just live austerely? You can see why that one didn't get too many people fired up. So why mention all these religious figures and faiths? Well, to show how India and South Asia was, and still is, a land of remarkable religious diversity. Sure, most of the populace follows the pantheon of Hindu gods, but there's also a staggering amount of other religions and philosophies. In the 5th century BC, while most other places in the world have their own core beliefs, there's nothing quite like what's happening in India. The Greeks aren't spreading the word of Poseidon, Zoroastrians don't really have missionaries, and the Hebrews pretty much keep to themselves. And for the time being, tolerance and honest discourse have the upper hand. But we're not just here to explore the religious history of India, and next time we'll begin to look at India from the perspective of those far more concerned with the current world as opposed to the next. Various kingdoms exist throughout the land, but no consolidated empires. Yet. While this episode focused on northeastern India, back west around the Indus River, the greatest empire of its day is knocking on South Asia's figurative doors. Not to mention that 150 years after the death of Buddha, a certain ambitious Macedonian has grand plans for this land. Stick around to learn all about the events that lead up to India's first empire on the podcast History of Our World.